Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. Prakash Shah, the eminent legal expert, joins me from London today. One of the questions I had for Dr. Shah was something that has been debated for many years. Why does India remain outside the International Refugee Convention? Now, this has brought up many subjects. It came up very powerfully during the entire Rohingya crisis. But also, the UN's own records show that India has had an inordinate number of what is known as internal intra-region refugees, so to speak, which means people from the South Asian subcontinent flowing consistently into India, many of them illegally, most of them, of course, from Bangladesh. Now, this has created a lot of political debate, a lot of volatility in this conversation. And yet, India, of course, while trying to block some of these inflows, remains outside the Refugee Convention. Why do we choose to do that? I will discuss with Dr. Shah. Dr. Shah, welcome.
Thank you. Namaste. Yeah.
Namaste. Let's begin, Dr. Shah, talking about why does India still choose to remain outside the Refugee Convention? Why does it not work for India to enter it?
Yeah, the conviction that India ought to remain outside of this international refugee protection system, which is embodied in the 1951 Refugee Convention of the UN and its 1967 protocol, was recently repeated by Amit Shah, I think, in the debate on the Immigration and Foreigners Bill, as it then was. It's
Home
now.
Minister of India, Amit Shah.
Yes, that's right. And of course, he put the matter in a very interesting way because he said that India ought to remain out of it, and yet India has a resource of traditions and its own culture, which has allowed it to provide protection to people who are fleeing persecution from different lands. On the one hand, you see that India wants to maintain sort of freedom with respect to international law and to admit people, which is really conditioned on whether or not it's consistent with India's national security and sovereignty. And this is an argument which has been repeated throughout the history of independent India. When the occasion came to become party to the 1951 Convention, which is of course very close in time to the drafting of India's own constitution and independence, a decision was obviously already made that India ought to remain outside of these arrangements. And even when the 1967 protocol to the Refugee Convention was put into place, India maintained its old position. Because the 67 protocol would have allowed countries to sign even if they hadn't acceded to the 1951 convention, but India maintained its position. So it seems like this formula of maintaining its interest consistent with its national security and the question of freedom of operation in terms of its own sovereignty are the predominant factors which allows India to maintain this position. And of course, there's no compulsion in international law to become party to any particular international treaty, except that there may be some sort of softer form of compulsion with respect to a country's standing with respect to international law. And of course, as India gets closer to its quest for acquiring a seat on on the Security Council of the United Nations, such questions will, of course, increasingly be coming to India. But I think it's correct that India has maintained its position, and that position is actually being given very good academic articulation in the work of Professor Bimal Patel, who is the Indian representative currently on the International Law Commission, and also holds a vice chancellorship in a university in Gujarat. And he's a prolific author, and he's maintained this argument, which is consistent with the Indian government position. So yes, so the long and short of it is that it's in India's interest to remain outside of this mechanism. Of course, I can go into the
In clear ways,
background.
could you explain to us why it's an interest, India's interest, to stay out of this convention? One of the reasons, of course, that India chose not to be part of it was its experience in partition. You know what it had seen during partition. We cannot forget the history of this. In 1947, as the British were leaving India, India was carved out into two different states, the Union of India, and of course a new sort of homeland, as it were, for the Muslims, Pakistan. And during that time, there was a massive refugee crisis during which 1 million people were killed. This is the backdrop against which India looks at this issue, isn't it, Dr. Shah?
Correct. But but in and of itself, that doesn't make it inconsistent with acceding to a document like the 1951 Convention, which is of course very close in time to the partition of India. And one could have said that those who are fleeing from Pakistan, either east or west, to India, would have received the protection of the convention had India signed it. But of course, in a way, there was no legal need to do so because the Constitution of India provided part protection for people fleeing the then newly created Pakistan. So it was the matters were taken care of, and the consistent flow of refugees since that time has been taken care of by India through administrative discretion and provision of citizenship to those who are fleeing Pakistan and of course now Bangladesh, if they are indeed subject to persecution. So again, I would say that yes, the partition history, of course, as tragic as it might be, and in so close in time to the formulation of the 1951 Convention, is in a way not a decisive argument one way or the other. But what's more interesting is that the 1951 Convention was designed by the United Nations, albeit to cater to the problems of refugees who had already come into being, and mainly come into being in the context of the war in Europe. So that is the backdrop against which the 1951 Convention was formulated, and also there are provisions within the 1951 Convention which allow a state to limit recognition only to those refugees who were emerging before 1951 in Europe in relation to events occurring before that date. So there are two important points there. There's a geographical limitation, which many countries have adhered to, and also that the convention is backward looking. Actually, the 1951 convention doesn't provide any obligation or impose any obligation on a state to recognize refugees who are coming after 1951. It's only relevant for refugees already in being. And most of those we're talking about are those refugees who became displaced as a result of the Second World War. So it's very much a backward-looking document, and not many people appreciate that. It's only with the formulation of the 1967 protocol that you see a forward-facing recognition of refugees who are not yet in being but could come into being in the future. And I'll say a few words about that. But let's stick to the 1950s because another important event happened in the 1950s, which is 1 year before the convention was opened up for signature. An entity called the United Nations High Commission for Refugees was also formed. Now, the legal origin of the 1950, the UNHCR, as it's called, as it's abbreviated into, is a General Assembly resolution. And it's very important to keep that in mind because what it means is that the legal basis for the operation of the UNHCR is very weak in international law. It doesn't have a solid treaty foundation. Its basis is simply in a General Assembly resolution. So basically, it's up to the community of states to decide in which direction the UNHCR should operate, to fund it, etc., etc. And there is no particular treaty mechanism which obliges states to cooperate with it, except the 1951 Convention. So if you link up the creation of the UNHCR and the 1951 Convention, what you find in the Convention is an article, Article 35, which obliges states to cooperate with the UNHCR. Now, that's a very underappreciated but critical article because if I, as a state, was a party to the 1951 Convention, I would be obligated to cooperate with the UNHCR. That's the only solid treaty basis at that time that the UNHCR had in order to gain some kind of recognition and cooperation from states. Now,
Questions that arise here, and I want to put this to you. One,
Yes.
of course, is considering how controversial many actions of the UNHCR have become in recent years. This obligation, there's a cloud over this obligation, and perhaps you could talk about that. Number one. Number
Yeah.
two, India's emphasis that it does not require such a convention to take care of refugees comes from its long tradition. You know, you mentioned, I think, the Jews and many others in the Parsis who found refuge in India. This tradition, as it were, in India continues to hold strong as far as even government institutional memory is concerned. And therefore, I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about both these two things, the UNHCR and the tradition.
Correct. Yes, I'm probably less less competent to talk about the tradition, but I'll have a go. But with respect to the UNHCR, you see, when it was formed in 1950, it was a minute body, and it tried to fit into the primary sort of paradigm of refugee protection then in play, which was one of legal protection. So, states were basically enjoined to provide some kind of recognition to the refugees with respect to provision of travel documents or recognition of qualifications, those sort of administrative acts or actions and measures. Now, in due course, we know that the UNHCR actually became a massively bloated, basically a kind of UN aid agency, right? Albeit specifically directed to the situation of refugees. But through the 60s, 70s, you see the budget of the UNHCR, its number of personnel, the kind of missions it's doing really explode, right? So it sort of changed beyond recognition. And the other thing that happened is that there was a kind of paradigm shift in terms of what refugee protection meant. Outside of the Western countries, the paradigm of legal protection was not relevant. And so, what the UNHCR began to do was to engage in a series of humanitarian missions, right? And already actually from the Hungarian crisis, where it's the legal legitimacy of the UNHCR was fairly weak, given the fact that the convention was a sort of backward-looking document, right into the 1960s with the various independence wars that were going on in, let's say, the African continent. The UNHCR became more and more a kind of activist and humanitarian body. Now, it's no coincidence that it's in the 1960s that the 1967 protocol to the convention got formulated. Now, in this case, it's a very interesting question to ask, why the 67 protocol? What's the point of it? Now, on the one hand, you can say, yes, this is a very positive document in the sense that it provides international recognition to refugees not even yet in being, who might come into being in future. Now, the geopolitical background to the enactment of the 67 protocol is a very interesting one because my research has indicated that it came into being at a time, of course, when the Cold War was at its height, in a sense. And the Cold War in Europe was actually translating into hot wars in many different parts of the world, which meant further production of refugees, cross-border movements, and so on. And so this was an opportunity to link up a kind of legal obligation which this 1967 protocol provided to the obligation on states to cooperate with UNHCR, which had by now become a very, you know, sort of expanded body with an expanded series of operations throughout the world, and to use the 67 protocol to provide some kind of legal basis for states to cooperate with the UNHCR in its aid missions, right? So you can see the sort of the very intricate linkage that international law provided as a basis for the operations of the UNHCR. Now, the UNHCR, of course, was primarily funded by Western countries, maybe mostly the United States, but also countries like Britain, countries in Western Europe. So the funders are the ones who call the shots. They are the ones who, in a way, because of their geopolitical interests, and also what's happening in Africa particularly in Africa at this time, is the evacuation of the European colonial powers and the filling in of that gap by, on the one hand, the Soviet Union, and on the other hand, the Americans. Right. So an expansion of American power is also in the background of what became the 67 protocol and plus the increasing activism of the UNHCR. Now, you can put two and two together and ask the question, pretty much as we know now, what UN, with respect to US aid and what it's been doing, is that whether or not these aid missions are in effect a kind of quest for influence in different countries in which they supposed to provide humanitarian assistance and so on. And of course, that's what exactly what I think the UNHCR became a vehicle for, right? Now, if you look at there's a separate document which is the African Convention on Refugees, right? Which the then Organization of African Unity, today's African Union. That document is also very interesting because one only has to look at the articles which provide or empower the UNHCR to play a role in the African context. And you realize, and of course, they're very close in time, 67 Protocol and 69, the African Convention. You realize how much effort international lobbying and international lawmaking had gone into the quest for giving influence to the UNHCR as an aid body, right? Um, and going back to India, of course, then you can say, well, the Indians would have read the signals very clearly, and they would have realized that engaging in the 1967 protocol, acceding to it, would allow the UNHCR also to begin to exercise an overwhelming influence in the many streams of refugees which were also coming to India, right, at the time. So uh, uh, it would have provided, I think, a good argument for India not to accede to these international arrangements, right? Although the African countries had willingly gone into the 67 protocol, their own convention on refugees and so on, of course, there's a very interesting discussion to be had about why the Africans accepted that and why the Indians didn't, right? And I think the Indians actually made the right choice then. So,
Do you think it's
yes.
true? Why do you think the Africans did and the Indians didn't? And why do you think
Uh,
India was right?
I suppose, well, anything I would have to say on this would be sort of just sort of, based on some commonplaces like, not having a very sophisticated state tradition, not being very jealous of one's sovereignty, um, and, perhaps more easily amenable to being influenced by the financial inflows, let's put it like that, in a polite way, which, becoming party to these international arrangements would have meant, at least for the leaderships of those countries, right? Now, that's not to say that some very independent-minded leaders of African states, particularly the Emperor Haile Selassie, uh, were also engaged in advocating that the African states ought to become party to these arrangements. So, it's not to say that it's only those states without a sophisticated state tradition which would have backed it. Other
Do you think
states like,
India's decision was right?
I think so. I think so, yeah.
No, but
Because,
why do you think, in retrospect, why do you think Africa's decision turned out to be wrong and India's decision turned out to be right?
well, I think that question is answered quite simply. Do you want that level of international influence and international sort of presence on your territory in order to administer humanitarian programs? And maybe you have a kind of state which is unable to do that. Maybe in the case of the African countries, they were simply unable to, set up refugee camps and look after people and so on. So it may have provided them with an incentive to engage in this. But the Indians, obviously, who are also coming from a very terrible economic circumstances after decolonization, were in a similar position but chose not to engage with this, right?
Talk a
Mm.
little bit about your arguments about how a tide of refugees that have come into Europe, in a sense, have taken advantage of this convention, especially from the 1980s onwards, and especially in recent years. Of course, some of that has been humanitarian, but there's been a lot of problems, especially in Europe, about the inflow of refugees and how many people, what kind of people have come in using the broad framework of this convention. And this has, of course, dramatically gone wrong in Europe because Europe is now really shutting its doors. Countries like Sweden and many others are who really opened their doors wide and now really clamping down. Talk to us a little bit about how it was misused and what went wrong.
Well, I think the Europeans made a mistake in a way by enthusiastically supporting and acceding to the 1967 protocol in particular. Because, as I said earlier, it was a forward-facing document. And in a way, you could say it was also a blank check to refugees who were not yet in being and who began to be increasingly coming to Europe as well. Um, to facilitate their recognition in some sense. That's one mistake. And the flow of refugees, which began to demand that they be recognized, was expanding, particularly from the 1980s onwards. With events like the Iranian Revolution and the Sri Lankan War and so on and so forth, right? And there's so many different conflicts happened after that, which led to a whole series of refugee movements. Um, Now, that's one issue. I mentioned earlier the point that relates to the second issue, which is the paradigm of legal protection. Now, European legal systems have strong state recognition systems or immigration law systems, right? But they also premise the administrative decision making to checks and balances by legal mechanisms, so access to courts, tribunals, and so on. And this meant that each individual case would have to be assessed on its own merits, but also it could get very easily tied up into a very elaborate structure of appeals and challenges, judicial reviews, and so on, right? Which means that anybody who happens to be on the territory, it'd be very difficult to actually get rid of them for years and years on end, which means that ultimately you'd lose the enthusiasm for deporting massive numbers of people who've de facto remaining on your territory. And so you'd have to resort to some kind of regularization programs and so on, right? But the invitation to claim asylum was, of course, facilitated by the recognition of the 1967 protocol. And in addition to that, the kind of legal paradigm of protection, right? If you looked at the African theater, you'd just get masses of people crossing the borders, right? And then there'll be aid missions and so on. But there wouldn't be this elaborate individual decision making or legal protection in the sense that the Europeans conceived of it. And so accumulation of those kinds of issues has led to the refugee problem becoming a really intractable issue for Europeans because they will not get rid of the idea that you've got to have legal protections and legal mechanisms to ensure that the administrative decisions are safe enough so that people are not sent back to countries where they're being persecuted and so on. But it's got to a level where, of course, people have smelt the coffee and said, well, if I go to Europe, there's a chance probably that I'll never be, removed or deported. So I'll try my chances. And that's exactly what people in successive decades, succeeding decades have been doing. And there have been, it's not that there have been any legal changes. If you look at the early 1990s, the Germans had to change their constitutional recognition of asylum, right? But despite of that, you see the flows have continued and continued, and leading to, of course, a massive de facto present foreigner population, right?
Now Europe wants to roll it back, but you're saying that would be difficult.
Well, it's not that voices haven't been raised about possibly reneging on the international arrangements, right, to which European countries have been a party. In the EU, when back in the late 1990s, when the Austrians had the presidency of the EU, there was a document circulated in advance of one of the plenary meetings. And there were serious discussions going on about whether or not discussions ought to be begun by European countries within the United Nations to reassess the nature of the international agreement structure that we have at the moment. Now, of course, individual countries also have the option to simply resign from the this 51 Convention plus 67 protocol. So that's also an option. Now, some politicians, like I think our Suella Braverman, right, our former Home Secretary in Britain, once she gave a speech after leaving office in the United States, and she also expressed that kind of viewpoint, right? It's not just the Refugee Convention and 67 Protocol now. Of course, there are other documents like the European Convention of Human Rights, about which there are active discussions whether to simply leave or limit the obligations which arise thereunder. There could be other international human rights agreements which are also will become an issue if more drastic steps are seen as necessary to be taken by different European countries. But this is really in a state of play at the moment, and we'll see how things pan out. But I don't think the existing arrangements are really viable anymore. I think I would agree actually with with Suella Braverman that you've got to actually start thinking about either a revision or reneging on these agreements.
Let's take a last couple of questions before we wrap up, Dr. Shah. One is, of course, like you said, it's become impossible to see how the existing status quo can infinitely continue. That does not seem feasible. Do you see more Asian countries sign up for this, considering what they're seeing in Europe? And finally, do you feel that India today has been validated, and its stance has been validated, and really already it's struggling with a lot of illegal infiltration? you know Getting
Yes.
into something like this was never going to be useful and won't be useful in the future.
Yes, that's a super question because it's not just India, actually, Asian countries as a whole, number one, lack their own refugee arrangements like the Africans had, but also most of them actually refused to sign up to the 51 Convention stroke 67 protocol. Now, in recent years, that's changed. So if you look at countries like Japan or South Korea or even the People's Republic of China, they've all actually acceded to it now. Now, once you do that, it's a very good laboratory to see what would happen should a country like India also sign up. Because the first thing that would happen is that there would be a pressure from United Nations bodies, maybe the UNHCR, for your country to start to institute recognition procedures, pretty much along the line that Europeans and the Americans, Canadians, and so on have, right? So the paradigm of legal protection would come into play. Then you'd have pressure on your officialdom because the argument would be raised that, well, you have the procedures in place, but you're simply not recognizing enough refugees. It seems like there's an under recognition of those people who are being potentially persecuted. So the argument would shift there, right? So there would be a constant dialogue actually moving against your country to the extent that you begin to lose discretion about who you want to and don't want to recognize, right? And this is another very good reason why India should simply avoid the whole game, right? Because you just don't want to get into this. Because ultimately, what do you want? Do you want countries like China, South Korea, Japan, and so on to be in the same position that the Europeans today find themselves, right? Because that's the paradigm that's being exported to them, right? So India has actually chosen a pretty wise path, and it ought to maintain its discretion while maintaining its traditions of protection.
Very well put. Dr. Shah, thank you very much. Very, very insightful comments, as always, on this extremely important issue of refugees and where India stands vis-a-vis the world. Thanks very much for your time. We'll have to leave it at that. No one. Obviously, in the future, as this issue grows, we will have more time with you to talk us through this issue as it develops. But at the moment, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Cheers.